Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Burning Desire Show with me, Charles Burns. I'm here today with Dr. Robert Yoho. I've pronounced that correctly, surely?
That's correct. Thank you.
I should always check these things before I actually go ahead and ask, but it is what it is. As per the general kind of way in which I like to run these things, I like to understand how the person, as in yourself, has got to where you've got to, and then you've obviously authored. It's 2 books, right? Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
2 books, and I'd like to talk about the main theme of being kind of the corruption within the medical industry, particularly in the United States, but I'm sure it applies elsewhere as well. So what I always am fascinated to understand, particularly people in like your community, medical community. Do you remember when you were younger in kind of, well, I think it's elementary school for yourself or kind of the high school, being very interested in the sciences, biology, all the rest of it? Where did the kind of medical, idea stem from for you?
Well, my parents are both doctors, and so
Okay.
I kind of got led into the thing by the nose, and so that's kind of the thing. And I did the typical, 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and 4 years of postgraduate training. I mean, it's insane, and you make a lot of you don't understand the sacrifices you're making as you're doing it, but it's crazy.
So again, I'm pretty sure it's the same from what I understand from my friends and the people I've spoken to in the American college system, where you choose majors and minors and you kind of mix and match subjects. Is it the same within medicine, doing your undergraduate degree, or is there a clearer path as to you have to take certain subjects to allow you to go into kind of the postgraduate piece?
Well, you catch a train, and the train is the medical training path, and the chemistry majors in undergraduate are the most highly prized because it's so challenging. At least it was when I was going through, and the medical schools gave you a better chance to get in. But I took an easier way out, which was a biology degree, because the chemists were, I mean, that was the hardest degree at my undergraduate school, Oberlin. And they worked 7 or 8 hours a day on their chemistry classes alone. I mean, it's crazy. Biology was a lot easier.
So you did the biology degree, Masters of Science Biology, and then you did your postgraduate after that, right?
The postgraduate in America, I'm not completely familiar with the British medical system, but I believe the undergrad and the medical system and medical training is integrated. But
yes.
In here, we get into medical school after an undergraduate degree, and that's medical school is 4 years. And then in order to get licensed, we perform 1 to 6 or 8 years of postgraduate training, and I did 4.
So in that postgraduate training, is that like physical hands-on work experience, for want of a better phrase, in hospitals, etc.?
It's partly hands-on and partly academic. It's 2 years of academics, more or less. And then the last 2 years, they throw you in the hospital long hours, and you just follow everyone around and try to pretend like your white coat means something.
I've asked someone before this, I think another doctor, what's it like when you are first in front of your first patient or first couple of patients, and you've got to use this theory that you've learned and apply it to an actual situation? What's going through your mind at that point?
Charles, I'm 68. That was a long time ago, but I remember feeling like an imposter.
Yeah. And is it within that kind of period of time of kind of you going around these general different parts of specialities, is that when you realize you want to go into one field or another, or how do you come to that piece?
Well, I had a little better idea because my parents were doctors, but
right.
When you're going around, you sort of get an understanding of whether you can tolerate the stresses of a given profession. Like, for example, neurosurgery is sort of, in my view, is at the top of the list for stresses. And they essentially enter the hospital and don't leave for 4 or 5 or 6 years of training. And I mean, it's very demanding. It's demanding of manual skills for the surgery. I mean, their surgeries can last up to 24 hours. I mean, it's crazy. I knew I wasn't suited for the rigors of even general surgery, which is much easier than neurosurgery. But so I ended up doing emergency medicine, and transferring to other fields during my career.
And your parents, what were their specialities in the medical sense?
My father was a urologist, which is kidneys and bladder, and my mother was a dermatologist, a skin doctor.
So then you spend some time, as you said, into the emergency. Is that literally, you call it ER, we call it A&E, it's the same thing, right? People who have
right
accident or emergency that they need dealing with there and then, trauma, etc.
Yeah, I did training in emergency medicine. I worked as an I got my took all the tests, the board certification, and all that in emergency medicine, and then ended up working as an emergency physician for several years, and then I transferred those skills into a sort of a family practice career. And within a couple of years, I began training in cosmetic surgery outside the established system. And I went to conferences every month for a decade. And I established skills in cosmetic surgery and became a cosmetic surgeon. And during the bulk of my career, I had an independent practice doing breast augmentations, enlarging boobs and liposuction and facelifts and that sort of thing. Which is another rabbit hole. Charles, I'm kind of like Rip Van Winkle. I did all this stuff and I stayed in that medical bywater. And I sort of woke up, I started studying medical corruption, and I woke up and I eventually published this book, Butchered by Healthcare, which is my primary interest here. Let me I need
Karen,
I need to do my disclaimer, which I forgot to do at the beginning of the podcast. This is not medical care. If you have a medical problem, you have to go see, a doctor and establish a relationship and use this information at your own risk. I'm sorry to have to do that, but in America, we have these people called plaintiffs' lawyers, and they sue you over anything. So go ahead.
For sure. So I'm interested. We will come on to the book for the meat of the conversation for sure. Yeah. So I'm interested as to how or why you came into the cosmetic side of stuff. Like, how did that come about?
Well, I did a year of dermatology in my training, a formal year, and the dermatologists in America are far more involved in cosmetic surgery, I think, than they are anywhere else in the world. And they do a variety of procedures. And I went to an American Academy of Dermatology meeting, and I sort of saw my future laid out. And I did better in an independent setting. So I knew that if I was able to have an independent practice, I would likely adjust better to that than hanging out in hospitals and filling out medical records and going to staff meeting with a bunch of people I didn't care about and so on. So I saw what eventually became my future when I went to that American Academy of Dermatology meeting. And I eventually trained with many physicians, including plastic and cosmetic surgeons and ear, nose, and throat facial plastic surgeons, and developed many mentorships besides just the dermatologist with these other surgeons, and developed over a period of, essentially you develop during your whole career as a physician if you're involved with the process. And I developed until the very end.
And so was cosmetic surgery, this was like what? This was in 92, from what I read, that you kind of started in this kind of this realm. In 1992, I hate to break it to you, but I wasn't actually born. But was cosmetic surgery in its nascent and new, or has it been around for a long time?
Well, it was well established, but you're right. It was in the midst of enormous upheaval and change. And the field that I was interested in, which was liposuction, that was only a few years old. And the techniques had been perfected, and I was able to attend the offices and assisted surgery with people who were the innovators and who had established the methods that it could be done as outpatient. Prior, 10 years before that, it was enormously bloody and it was risky. And the new methods, which involved putting a large quantity of saltwater solution with adrenaline and anesthetic into the patient's fat, had evolved and transformed the whole thing into something that now is done very commonly by people at outpatient facilities, and they do it and go home right away.
Excuse me, ignorance, but like how do people, the inventors of these techniques, like how do they come across these ideas? Is it like a trial and error thing where they kind of say to a patient, we're trialing something new out, do you want to, like, how does that work?
Charles, as you study one field and get more and more understanding of all the basics and then the advanced work, you sort of are able to see into the future. And this is true for any field. This is true for mathematics, it's true for any science field. And these brilliant guys who put together the new techniques from the past techniques were standing on the shoulders of many, many people. And so I don't think there's anything unusual about the process in medicine as opposed to any other science or even business. It's a process of sort of being able to see the future when you are completely conversant with everything that's happened in the past.
So you mentioned that liposuction was a particular specialty yourself, plus the breast augmentation.
Yeah.
What do have a rough understanding, but of how liposuction works? But as a layman, like how would you describe the process or what you're trying to achieve?
Okay, so the doctor will you will draw on your skin the areas that he wants to contour, on the fatty areas with a Sharpie marker usually. And then we typically cleanse the skin with some, stuff to bring down the bacterial count. Chlorhexidine is typically used. And then often the patient is given a sedative drug like Valium or sometimes opioid such as Demerol. And then we are able to put a little local anesthetic in areas and puncture the skin and place literally sometimes gallons of local anesthetic fluid, which is very, very dilute or not very concentrated, into the fat itself. And then the patient sits around for 15 or 20 minutes, and the liposuction commences with a rod with a hole in the end connected to suction. The fat flows into the bottle, and when you're done, you're put in a compression girdle that covers the entire area, and some of the extra fluid will drain out over the next 12 to 24 hours. And the healing process takes, the complete healing process takes several months, but the early healing, where you're pretty much okay, is just a few days. Alternatively, some people use a general anesthetic, but that's unnecessary these days. That's done more safely without using a general anesthetic, which poses additional risks.
And so I presume the people that are getting this done is aesthetic, right? Most of the time, is it that they're looking to this bit, the body they want to look better? Is that the main reason we'll get liposuction?
Yeah, it's the only reason. There are some theories that it improves diabetes and other things, but it probably doesn't, because people can gain the weight so rapidly back. Even large volumes of fat removal doesn't do the trick.
So I think this question leads on to where we're going with the your view now on the medical community or industry. When someone presents themselves to your clinic at the time and wanted breast augmentation or liposuction or facelift or whatever the case may be, what's the ethics involved from your side to qualify them for going through with the surgery versus not? Like, is it, or do you have the view that everyone's body's their own body and what they want to do with it is what they want to do with it?
Well, first of all, you have to recognize that anytime you're getting paid to do a procedure per procedure, there's a huge conflict of interest, and it's very difficult to separate separate out your needs from the patient needs. And it's easy to convince yourself that selling a surgery that maybe is marginal or not completely indicated is reasonable if you get paid a lot of money. So we're seeing a lot of that in healthcare now. And I just want to preface my comments with that it's a struggle to be completely a patient advocate, to see the patient first as your only ethic. Right. But with that disclaimer, we tried to be counselors, and we turned away at least 10% of the patients who would physically have been good candidates because we didn't think they were psychologically qualified. They had unrealistic ideas about it, or they had various problems. So you have a look at them, you see what you can, and you have a good feel after you've done a few hundred or a few thousand cases. You have a good feel about what happens after the surgery. You look at the risks, and of course, if they have a lot of medical problems, it may not be the smartest thing at all. I'm sorry. Yep. So you look at the patient, you try to entirely serve their interests, and you counsel them about what's reasonable, what can be done, and whether it's reasonable for them, given their body and their psychological setup.
That makes sense. So you spent the best part of almost 30 years as a cosmetic plastic surgeon, right?
That's correct.
And you then written this book, which you alluded to before, called Butchered by Healthcare. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so what I'm interested in understanding is, at what point in time did you, so you're retired now, it's important to note for people listening, at what point in time did you start to really look at the industry as a whole, which then led you to writing this book and where we are today?
Yeah, here's and this is into the weeds of my background, but about 4 years ago, I started looking at healthcare corruption, and that my entry into it was because I did hormone therapy for my patients, who were mostly women. And these women, by the time I quit, I was I was in my 60s, and most of my patients were 50 and older, and they were going through the change of life. And so I realized that our current standards for hormone therapy were somehow completely false. I mean, we've got these warnings put on by the FDA that these hormones are dangerous. And in actuality, they are some of the best treatments that we've ever seen. And we have over 100 years experience with some of them, and 80 to 100 years of experience with most of the rest. And so I took classes and training about how to prescribe hormone therapy. Can you hear that dog?
A little bit.
Well, if he's bugging you, I'll let him in. You want me to do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. 10 seconds.
Sure. So we're talking about you realized that the hormone therapy you were giving was much safer than led to believe.
Right. And so step by step, I was led into this medical corruption field after I realized that the hormones, I initially wrote, I ended up writing this book called Hormone Secrets, which is a guide to hormone therapy and a treatise about how the hormones have been butchered by industry. And they're trying to sell patent drugs, so they've slandered and defamed these other drugs, which work. They're some of our most reliable and advantageous drugs in the whole formulary. It's amazing. So anyway, I got into the corruption thing, and pretty soon I was studying, big pharma, and I was studying the insurance industry, and I was studying all these corrupt medical specialties. Just
led you into writing the book, right?
Yeah, and that led me into writing. I mean, this is a 4-year process I'm describing that led me into writing Butchered by Healthcare, which, these things they're not moneymakers, Charles. They're selling about 30 copies a day, but it's the advertising costs are its exact break even.
Yeah.
So it's a passion project, and it's the corruption in medicine is such an outrage that I feel compelled to promote the whole thing.
So it's interesting, actually, timing wise, because I, as probably a lot of people, just have watched Dope Sick. Are you familiar with Dope Sick, the drama?
No, but
Okay.
that's about opioids.
Yeah, so Dope Sick is it's Michael Keaton stars in Dope Sick. It's on Disney Plus in the UK and Hulu in the US, and I don't know what elsewhere where it's on. And it tells a story of OxyContin and the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, etc. Now, interesting enough, I was doing some research into yourself, and some of the stats that you provide on the US healthcare system are pretty startling. One being that the medical spend is twice that of similarly developed countries, that 70% of Americans take some form of pharmaceuticals.
50 to 70%, depending on the estimate.
20% take 5+ drugs.
It's crazy. The nursing home patients often are taking 20 drugs, and this means that they are essentially medication farms. Those things can't possibly be helpful. It's ridiculous. They're just like gorks. Some of them are just gorks hooked up to the pharmaceutical machine, and their medications cost thousands or tens of thousands of dollars a month, and it's all goes billed straight to Medicare and in the pockets of the pharmacies and the big pharma companies who manufacture the drugs.
So I'm interested because obviously if you look at kind of life expectancy, and I've not looked at it precisely, but from what I know anecdotally, people are living longer than they ever have done before. But are they like living healthier, or are we just kind of like perpetuating people's lifespans? But actually it's with, artificial drugs, etc. And really, if we let people quote unquote a bit more but die naturally, that would be a better kind of thing to do. What's your view on that?
Well, the trend towards longevity has been a century-long trend, or even longer. But the last 20 years has seen a reversal of some of that. And certainly in America, where we have people like Anthony Fauci running the show and passing out almost $1 trillion worth of research money during his lifetime, we're getting sicker. There's no doubt about it. And the lifetime has declined. And the other interesting statistic is that although America spends double per person on healthcare of any other country, Britain spends 10% of their gross domestic product, and we spend 20 of our massive gross domestic product, which is double per person, what any other country, Canada, France, Australia, all spend about 10. We have mortality that is worse than any of the other ones. It's about 20th in mortality, and so the whole thing doesn't do any good. And in the academic sphere, they know that about 50% of our healthcare is either neutral or injurious, and that's not controversial. 50% of American healthcare is. Now, I'm not saying Britain is a paragon. You have lots of problems there too. And some of these companies have threatened to leave Britain because Britain is so dependent on the pharmaceutical company, tax revenue and so on. They threaten to leave Britain if they don't fall into line with their agendas, such as approving an antidepressant or something like that. So Britain's not a paragon, and you've got essentially the same problems, but ours is magnified by throwing more money and bad solutions.
And is it really, simply put, just a capitalist kind of money grab that's caused the corruption, as you call it, or the kind of, the pharmaceutical companies are getting bigger and richer, but the products that they're outputting not making patients healthy? Is that the crux of the problem?
The golden rule is not what we think it is. It's he that has the gold makes the rules. And the perfect example is this insane vaccine narrative where I believe Pfizer is due to make $30 billion, or it may be that the whole vaccine industry is due to make $30 billion in 1 year. Now, these guys typically make $1 billion the first year, and they have expenses, like marketing expenses and all that. Now the governments are enforcing vaccine mandates and all this insanity, and the expenses are less. And $30 billion is enough to buy off anyone. And it only takes a few million or 10 million or 20 million to buy off some physician prostitute like Sanjay Gupta. Have you ever heard of him? He's an American commentator who is singing the party line and claiming the vaccines work and all this other stuff that's pretty much it's just fraudulent.
So is the general medical community in America, I've not actually heard that much here, saying the same thing in respects of the COVID vaccines we're referring to here, just being ineffective and unnecessary? Is that the general kind of play, or are they in the pockets of big pharma and therefore that's not the general?
Charles, everybody's in the pockets of big pharma. And the problem is that the media companies and the tech companies are in the pockets of big pharma. And pharma and the medical industries, certainly pharma's standard operating procedure is to create stories that are absolutely false and release them to the media. They do studies of drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine that were faked or possibly used doses that were many times the toxic dose, even killing people in third world countries in order to produce a study that claims that these drugs don't work. And the problem with that is that if they had a therapy that worked, and these therapies definitely work, they'd be unable to market an experimental drug like these vaccines. It typically takes at least 5 years. 5 years is a benchmark, but it takes 8 years to understand whether any kind of drug works at all. It takes 8 years of studies, and these things are just thrown at us like they're godsend, together with a fear-mongering campaign of how dangerous COVID is. And this is not new behavior. And if the listeners want to hear the background and see further examples of this being done over the last 20 years, My Butchered by Healthcare has it explained at a very basic level. It's got 500 references too. So that's the.
So how, I'm sure your book would help with this, but how does a layperson figure out which kind of drugs are good for them, and for want of a better phrase, and which are just marketing? How do you figure that out without code matter research?
Well, there's a couple of things you can do now that we couldn't do before, and this is kind of the positive story. You can consult with any doctor you want now if you're in the US via Skype or whatever. And prior to this, it wasn't considered acceptable to consult without an in-person visit. But Trump did an executive order last year and during the COVID thing, and he said that it was now acceptable. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are patient groups that you can join. Now, these are largely sponsored by big pharma, but they have very sincere people in them, and you can consult your patient group for your particular disease or entity, and you can communicate directly with the other patients in the groups, and you can often find the truth from people who know as much about the disease as the doctors. So those are some clues for people, but my advice is to understand the scene as much as you can, read as widely as you can, and start with my book, because you have the information there. The references are, if you buy the ebook for $4, you can just click through to the references if you don't believe anything I say. But so that's the patient view of it. And
I'm also interested from a personal level as well, but we talked about your view that people are actually getting sicker or unhealthier kind of over a period of time. You also, as a stat you mentioned, or I've read, you've talked about that 1 in 6 people in America use psychiatric medication.
Oh, this is the worst.
Yeah, now, it's interesting how this plays out.
Well, psychiatry, in my view, is the most corrupt medical specialty. And you have to understand that all my views are derivative of other writers. I don't have any original material in my work. And the drugs in psychiatry have not been subjected to sugar pill controlled trials the way other drugs are, because the endpoints are entirely subjective. In other words, the psychiatrist or the shrink, he decides what is happening more or less. And so, and the drugs are tremendously toxic. They're far more toxic than anyone gives them credit for. The addiction quality of every single psychiatric drug it's unlike an opioid, but it's profound. And for example, to get off Prozac, many people require tapering doses for 6 to 12 months. And they still have breakthrough anxiety and depression, which are symptoms of getting off the drug rather than symptoms of their underlying illness. Mm-hmm. Most of these psychiatric conditions that are being treated heavily with drugs now, in their native state, wax and wane. They get better and they get worse. But once you're on the drugs, you're stuck on the drugs. You're stuck with the behavior the drug produces. And this can include violent behavior and suicides from the SSRI class drugs like Prozac. These side effects are not obviously in every person, but it's a few percent of people have violent or suicidal thoughts, and a few of them act on that. And we think many of the mass violence situations in America were related to either getting off of one of these drugs or being on one of these drugs. So bring me back to your interest here.
So there's a couple of things there. So what, people talk about this, but in psychiatric conditions, I've heard them, people talk about 4 kind of chemical imbalances and that.
Oh yeah. Okay, that's important. That's an important point. Let me just delve into that for a second.
Yeah.
So everybody's heard about this chemical imbalance in the brain corrected by the magical Prozac or whatever, the SSRI or the other drugs. Even the antipsychotics have the same story attached to them. That story was invented in a big pharma marketing department. Okay, there's no scientific basis for it. You have to think of these drugs as quite toxic, brain-altering drugs. They do what's called cross the blood-brain barrier, which means they get into the brain, unlike most drugs, and they produce behavior alterations and addiction that's far more profound than you can ever imagine. So that I want all the listeners to understand that crossing the bit about these things supplying a chemical imbalance and correcting it is entirely a marketing construct.
So, someone had kind of some sort of psychiatric condition or whatever the case may be, is your view never to really use drugs and you should use therapy and other methods, or you think there's cases where actually, case by case, certain drugs do work for certain people and that kind of thing?
My view is that less than 5% of these things are used for appropriate indications. In other words, that we have marketed, they were developed with the help by doctors who are working hand in hand to market the big pharma point of view, which is give them for everything, almost anything. And they're casually prescribed with the use of a questionnaire that takes 5 minutes to fill out, and the doctor comes in, throws a prescription at the patient, and they can sometimes be committed to these things for life because they're so difficult to get off in most cases. So my view is that there's 4 classes of these things, right? You've got the ones I mentioned, the SSRI antidepressants like Prozac, everyone's heard of those. And the violence and the addiction are the big problem with those. And then we have a far more pernicious class of drugs called the atypical antipsychotics. Now, these things shorten lifespan by 5 to 10 years, is well documented. And they're thrown around like jelly beans by the psychiatrists and sometimes even by the primary care doctors. Mm-hmm. Then we have the benzos like Valium, right, and Xanax. Those things are highly addictive. They require tapering doses also to get off of them. And they have tremendous, they have short-term relief of anxiety. The initial studies with Xanax, for example, I think, I don't want to misquote this, but it's very close to exactly what happened. They had 2 weeks of patient improvement with the initial studies, 2 weeks of neutral. And then when they tried to taper the patients off the drugs, they got much, much worse. The drugs were nevertheless approved by a Food and Drug Administration that is in the pockets of big pharma. Your listeners should understand that the FDA is entirely corrupted, that anything they say should be regarded as suspect, because about half of their revenues come directly from the pharmaceutical companies in the patent approval process. That means they're in the pockets of pharma, and if they refuse to allow patenting of a drug, they might have trouble making their payroll.
Sure.
I mean, it's, yeah. So anyway, that's 3 of the 4 classes. We've got the benzos, the SSRIs, the like Prozac, and then the and then the atypical antipsychotics that shorten your lifespan, and then we have the amphetamines. So these drugs and the amphetamine-related compounds like Ritalin, right? And these things are, again, they're passed out like jelly beans in the United States. In Japan, they hardly let them in the country. In France, they think they're very limited utility. They were used by kamikaze pilots in World War II to psych up, to drive their planes into the American ships and commit suicide. They've been known to be highly addictive and highly dangerous drugs for, 50 years plus. But we are promoting these things now in adults for, you've heard this ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
for adult ADHD. And they're talking about, I mean, it's crazy. They're talking about using antidepressants to prophylax or prevent depression when people have conditions like heart attacks. So it's a market for everyone. And these guys have pushed the consumption of psych drugs up to 17 or 18% of Americans, which is absolutely insane. I mean, psych drugs for these things just cannot be indicated for that many. Anyone with any common sense just has to shake their head and say, these people are in the pockets of the drug pushers, and those are, anyway.
So just on this mental health kind of section, point, you hear more and more about people have anxiety or bipolar or all these different depression or whatever banded around. Is there a case to say, let's say like 50, 60 years ago, were people just not talking about it as much, or was it not as prevalent? Or is it again like a marketing campaign, in your opinion, that has led people to now label things really quickly when it's just the natural flow of life? Like, what's actually going on there?
Well, the diagnostic Bible of psychiatry is called the DSM, right? And it undergoes iterations every 3 years or so. And the new diagnoses are voted in by a vote of, I believe it's the American Psychiatric Society. And this thing was created primarily by pharmaceutical companies and doctors in the pay of the pharmaceutical companies. And the conflict of, they call, in America, in America, the American medical academics are allowed to do anything they want. They can get paid, they can get bribed, and the only thing they have to do, in theory, is to put a disclaimer at the end of the article saying, here are my conflicts of interest. Well, in other fields, such as law or government, conflict of interest would result in firing or sometimes criminal prosecution. But in medicine, it's business as usual. So the psychiatry industry is funded and maintained and created by the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors in the pay of the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, it's probably the worst one. I can talk about oncology or cancer therapy as another good example of the problems, if you want.
I don't know if you go into in your book in any depth as to like countries that are less economically developed. Let's take the continent of Africa as a whole. Are people healthier there, less healthy because they take less drugs? Like, what's going on there? How do you compare that to, say, the America, Britain, etc.?
Well, it's certainly true that the only true control group we have for these psychiatric in America, by the time we started studying these psych drugs, everybody was freaking on the psych drugs, right? So we couldn't develop a control group. And in fact, these studies of the psych drugs suffer from the lack of a sugar pill control group, that's the standard, right? Yeah, placebo. So the only good idea we have of what a control would be is a third world country. And all of these psychiatric entities are much less chronic in third world countries where they can't afford the ridiculous price of the drugs. So, and again, they wax and wane. They're not considered chronic. And the other interesting factoid is that our American social support systems, chronic disability and so on, rose in tandem with the drug use increase, right? So the observers think it's causal due to the drugs. So they get on these drugs, they're non-functional forever, and they have to stay on the drugs or they have horrendous withdrawal symptoms.
Sure, that makes sense. And just changing lanes slightly, does your book or does your experience extend to how the system in where I'm based in the UK, which has the National Health Service or NHS, for people that don't know, it's free at the point of need requirement, pretty much across like almost every vertical you think of in the medical community. How does that change or differ? Obviously in America, it's far more, you have to pay for healthcare effectively, right? But most people anyway.
Well, I can't comment too much about Britain, except for to say you're in trouble too, because the big healthcare companies dominate over there. But I can say that we have the worst possible combination of capitalism and socialism, right? In other words, we supply the money to these people, we throw the money at them, the money rains out of the sky at our healthcare, and they take it and they use it to bribe us. That's the way it works. Because this industry at 4 trillion plus in America, and there are rumors that it's gotten way higher since the COVID thing hit, this industry is the same size as our federal government. Might be bigger. It's the federal government revenues are 3.5 trillion here. The industry is 4 trillion, right? Wow. Just for another perspective, you know that the market capitalizations or the total value of Google and Apple alone are far bigger than our federal government. So these guys, it's really, when you think about it, it's no surprise that they get away with whatever they bloody well feel like getting away with. And right now, they're censoring us, which is an abridgment of our First Amendment rights to free speech. It's the thing that is unique to America. Our Constitution is more robust than anywhere else in the world, and it's why we're not quite having as much trouble as everywhere else, because we have our Constitution. But the most important amendment, the First Amendment, the right to free speech, is being abridged and truncated by these tech companies, and they are obviously being bought by the other forces. Mm-hmm. Which are complex, and it's too much for us to go into the whole thing here, but it's a heck of a scene, and anybody that doesn't think we're in trouble should look at Australia and New Zealand and Germany. I mean, it's just the outrages that are being perpetrated there are just incredible.
So I have kind of two final questions. One is, do you think that when you were in practice that you were unaware of what was going on because you were kind of couldn't see the wood for the trees, for want of a better phrase? You were involved with it and you didn't necessarily see what's happening, or was it just that it wasn't quite as pronounced as it is now, or is it that you just, because you're from the outside looking in, you have a better overall picture?
Well, the medical practice is consuming, Charles. In other words, you barely have time for anything. You can take care of your patients and you can sort of manage your office. You have, if you're a hospital physician, you have to run back and forth to the hospital. You got to do continuing medical education. It's endless. And there are some people who I regard as polymaths or geniuses who do it all well, keep up with the medical literature, have a good family life and everything else. But it's very hard to do anything. And like I say, I kind of woke up because of my sequence of what I was involved with, and I have a natural interest in writing, and so I started to write about it.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I guess my final question, to try and end this on hopefully a positive note, okay, let's frame it this way. If everything was a utopian kind of environment, like, how would things be different? How would you what would your recommendations be to kind of, we could start from scratch in the kind of medical community with the mission being to improve people's well-being and healthcare? Like, what would we be doing differently?
Well, first of all, I don't want to imply that all medicine is bad or that doctors are all bad or anything like that. We do miracles daily in medicine, but the thing has definitely devolved and it's a mess. There are solutions in my book that would work, but they're impossible politically because this healthcare is by far the biggest lobby in Congress. It essentially buys off all the opinions of those people, and you can't vote against them. And it's on both sides of the aisle with few exceptions, the Democrats and the Republicans. So the solutions I propose are impossible politically, but they include things like, if we killed drug patents, that would just slow down the whole thing, wouldn't it? The drug patents are the mechanism by which all this profiteering has occurred. There are some commentators that have recommended putting all the medications on over the counter, except for opioids, and in my opinion, any of these psych drugs, which I think we should lock up very carefully, and amphetamines. So, and that's done in other countries, and it works fairly well. It takes the power out of the hands of the establishment, and if the people get horrible side effects when they try something over the counter, they're going to throw it away instead of being encouraged by their doctor and all the ads and all that. We permit in the United States and one other country, direct-to-consumer ads are permitted, right? In other words, we have all this stuff on TV regarding these medicines that cost thousands of dollars a month. Well, and are paid for, of course, by the third party, which is the worst of all worlds. They're either paid for by insurance or they're paid for by a government program like Medicare. So, and that encourages overconsumption and waste. There's nobody watching the till. So everyone agrees that getting rid of direct-to-consumer ads is a good idea. These ads run in other countries too because they're used as filler in the TV shows. Because they don't have enough money they don't have enough advertisers to fill everything. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the ideas. I have a complete guide to what would clean everything up in my book, but you have to understand that the only thing that's going to clean everything up is a great crisis. And that we've got that brewing with all the money printing and all the other nonsensical narratives that are going on over here, and the rest of the world sort of blindly following.
I guess I did say that's my final question, but I have something else that's popped up. Have you surveyed other countries? Like, where's a good right now a good model behavior, and what country and why?
Well, there's no country that's free of this stuff. The poorest countries are influenced by experimental programs that are foisted on them by Fauci. And reading Kennedy's book, and you can get that for $3 on Kindle, and you can read all about that. But there are some good things, right? I mean, you guys don't do as many mammograms as we do over here, and the numbers on mammograms are not good. I believe Switzerland and France backed off from any recommendations for routine mammograms. Of course, if you have a problem or a lump, then you get a mammogram. Japan rejected the HPV vaccine, which is a human papillomavirus or the wart vaccine, which supposedly decreases cervical cancer. And they looked at the fact that the pharmaceutical companies had hidden 50% of the studies on the HPV vaccine. And when somebody has lied to you over and over and over, your conclusion must be that you can never trust them again. And that's the case with these pharmaceutical companies, because they have more criminal settlements with the federal prosecutors in the US than any industry in history. Well, Japan, they're not perfect either, but they rejected, at least they rejected and threw out the HPV vaccine, and less than 1% of their people or their kids get it. You've had it, and all of our kids have had it over here because the pharmaceutical companies are so powerful. So,
yeah, no, listen, I think it's been a really interesting and wide-ranging interview. And of course, if people are interested and it's piqued their curiosity about learning more about the system at a more granular level and more kind of a better understanding than your book, Booked by Healthcare, as you've shown a few times, available on Amazon and I guess other outlets as well, where you can find it, right?
Yep, that's right. And then the Hormone Secrets book. And then my website is robertyohoauthor.com. And on there is information about COVID and the vaccine frauds and the therapies that are being withheld from COVID patients. And they probably would have saved 85% of the people who died. I mean, it's a really, really crazy narrative. When I got started on that, the rest of medical corruption seemed like minor league stuff.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for your time. And yeah, I'll pop the links into the description for your book and the other kind of information that you mentioned as well.
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate coming on.
Thank you.